There are a lot of weapons in Mech Arena, and there is a lot to know about all of them, but for most people, you just need the basics to get you started, and that's what this video is here. So I'm going to be going through all of the major weapons, and we are going to start it off with the Barrage category because it contains two of the least understood weapons in the entire game. Now, what people don't understand about these weapons is that it detects hitboxes within the crosshair. The weapon will auto-adjust its angle, so if your crosshair is directly on an obstacle in front of you, it will angle your weapons down and fire the projectiles straight into that obstacle in front of you. If it's targeted into the distance, it will fire your weapons at whatever distance is required to get those projectiles to land at the exact point that your crosshair is. There's obviously a maximum range, but that's essentially how it works. Now, in order to target enemies from behind cover, you have to understand that when it detects an enemy hitbox behind an obstacle, it will automatically prioritize the hitbox and it will count that as the thing that you're looking at. So you could be looking at that same wall, but now there's an enemy behind it, and it will automatically adjust your weapons to target the enemy as opposed to the obstacle itself. So by understanding that priority and by understanding the concept of hitbox detection inside the cursor itself, the little dot reticle, by understanding that, you don't have to come out from cover in order to use nade launcher and cryo launcher. You don't have to do any of this weird stuff with your aiming. You don't have to deal with all that frustration. But I would say that if you want to use it the most effectively, you do want to keep range, and trying to hit people who are moving while doing that. Usually what ends up happening is the projectile hits where they were and not where they are, and you end up dealing no damage. So what I tend to do, and what I would recommend most people to do, is to look straight up into the air and fire your weapons. This ensures that your cursor is pointing way into the distance, up to like the top of the map, which maximizes your range. So long as you know what your max range is, then you know exactly where you're firing, and you can use that as a sort of carpet bomb within a specific area and not have to worry about any type of weird range variation or not knowing where your projectiles are actually going to land. You know exactly where they're going to land. They're going to land 80 meters for nade launcher, 95 meters for cryo launcher. Pod gun is the other one in the barrage category. It's not much to know about this one. You just have to understand that like there's a 2-second damage delay when you hit an enemy with it. There's a 4-second damage delay if you hit an obstacle or an ally. So you're not going to deal damage immediately, and the damage that you do deal is pretty high, but not the highest. So you generally want to keep range. You don't want to be super close to your enemies, but you do want to keep the homing. Pod gun has infinite maximum range. It says 300, but it can hit people from over 300, but you only get homing at 100 meters and less. So I would try to keep yourself between like 50 and 100 meters to maximize your range while also keeping the homing aspect. Bounce critter. Oh boy. This one, under normal circumstances, I would generally say that in order to maximize or to optimize for the fact that it can bounce and hit multiple enemies, you want to be prioritizing multiple targets. So you want to try to hit enemies that are close together so that you can deal all of that total damage and actually deal decent damage as opposed to the really garbage damage that you would deal if you were to only target one opponent, right? That's just the way that the weapon is built to operate as. But unfortunately, by hitting multiple enemies, the first one takes 100% of your projectile damage. The second one takes 60% of your projectile damage, right? So just from a pure mathematical standpoint, you double your opponents, you double the amount of damage that you take, presumably, but you are not quite doubling your damage output, so you actually will survive for less time if you operate in that specific way. So generally speaking, if you want to survive, then I would actually go with single mech encounters as much as possible and not try to engage with full groups of enemies unless you're a mech that can actually do that. Some mechs can do it better than others. Moving into the assault category. Fusion cannon, I mean, there's not much to know about it. It's just a bad weapon, honestly. The DPS is kind of low. The projectile speed is kind of low. The magazine is kind of low. You are forced to get kind of close because of your low projectile speed. It makes it very, very difficult to hit enemies that are like 50 meters away and further. But you also don't have the DPS to really be brawling with many things. So in most circumstances, you want to keep between like 30 and 40 meters range inside that sweet spot there. Same thing kind of happens with carbine. It says in the weapon description that it fires high velocity rounds, but they're not. They have the same projectile speed as Voltaic RPG, which is 160. It's not very much. So the projectile speed is also slow, which forces you to stay sort of close to your targets, but while the weapon itself doesn't have great DPS, you also don't want to get too close to enemies that might have better weapons, right? So anywhere between like 30 and 50 meters is usually around where you want to keep yourself. Viper is a little bit different. This one has very good effective range. Your maximum range is like 110, and you can pretty easily hit targets at that distance because your projectile speed is pretty good, and so long as your rockets actually are homing toward the target that you want them to, you don't have to worry about them. What you do have to worry about is making sure that the rockets are actually hitting, because your rockets are more than 50% of your total damage output. Every time you fire 8 projectiles and then you shoot the rocket, those 8 projectiles combined deal less damage than the 1 rocket that you shot. So it's very important to maximize and optimize for your rockets. It's very important to avoid shooting at stealthed enemies if you can, because the rockets won't home in on those. And it's also important to not get too close, because very often that causes the rockets to do weird things as well. So your total DPS is actually very high. I believe it's the highest of all of the assault weapons, but it does require that all of your rockets hit, which is not super practical. And I would still recommend staying outside of close quarters weapon range. Overdriver is probably the most popular assault weapon, and for good reason. Very high damage output. The damage number that you see on the stats is actually not your base damage, it is your average damage. So your base starting damage is going to be 0.8 times whatever it shows on that stat screen, and from the point of 0% burn up to 50% burn, it will slowly build up from 0.8 times to 1.2 times of what the listed number is, so 50% more damage from where you started off. After that 50% burn from 50 to 100, it just caps out there. You're dealing 1.2 times your base damage. And so what you want to do is you want to build up the burn up until just above 50% and then feather it and keep it between 50 and 100% at all times. You don't want it to reach 100% because when it does that, then it forces you to reload. You lose out on a lot of time and you have to then build up your damage all over again. So it's better to just stop firing for a second, let it cool down, and then continue firing. As far as assault weapons go, Oracle's DPS is very, very bad. It's very minimal. And so you should not try to use this at any close range at all. You should try to use it as far range as possible. Your maximum range is very high. It's 140, and then you can also extend that with an implant to get like absolutely crazy maximum ranges. There's a bit of spread on your projectiles as well, which keeps your range from being crazy. About 100 meters is where your effective range starts to struggle. But essentially, you want to keep yourself within that sweet spot. There is the perk where the last 65% of your magazine drone thing that comes out and it deals additional damage, but that drone also applies a reveal status effect that allows you to see enemies through walls and stuff like that. Now you might be tempted to try to optimize for that status effect and just apply that reveal status on as many enemies as possible, but generally speaking, everyone knows where most enemies are at all times on the map anyway, and since the reveal status doesn't actually tell you any information about those enemies, it doesn't really help that much. So I would prioritize, just as you would with any other weapon, focus down a single target, deal as much damage to them as you can, and try to kill them. Berserker is like almost the exact opposite. You really don't want to be that far away. In fact, the max range is 80 meters. Berserker has a specific quirk in which if you hold the trigger for too long, it starts to really increase the spread of the projectiles to a nearly unusable level. Its effective range goes from 80 meters to 5 meters, basically. So once it starts to spread out is essentially the point where you have to say like, okay, I'm going to chill on the trigger for a little bit. You give it like 2 to 3 seconds to calm down, and then you can continue firing. This point in which you should stop firing is about halfway through the magazine. So essentially what you want to do is you want to fire it in bursts of like 50% magazine. And that will keep your effective range at 80, which is the maximum. Your damage will be very, very high. That last half of your magazine is where you get the most damage because it builds up to 100% double damage chance. So that last half of your magazine is where you get most of your damage from. And that's why it's really important to chill on holding down the trigger halfway through is because you need that last half of your magazine to actually hit stuff. If it's not hitting stuff, then you're losing out on all of that potential damage. Reaver is another one that has pretty low effective range, but it's basically constant damage. You basically just never hold off the trigger. Insanely low reload time, so you basically have constant damage, but your maximum range is pretty low. One thing that I do want to kind of point out is visually, it looks like its range is actually way less than it really is. Its effective range and its max range even is way higher than you think it is. So I would encourage you to look at the stats, figure out what's the max range, including whatever range implant you might have. The Reavers that I'm using, it was 72, and then I upgraded the range implant one more time. I believe it's 75 now. It's very important to know that because you don't actually lose a lot of damage. So I try to keep basically at the very edge of my maximum range with Reaver, because even though the damage is good, it's not like close quarters weapon brawler good. So I try to keep as far away as I can while being just inside the maximum range to maximize both my distance from the enemy, which keeps me as safe as possible, but still keeping me within range so I can actually deal damage. Speaking of close quarters weapons, let's talk about Ember Gun. Similar to Reavers, like basically no reload time. You can essentially just hold the trigger. It's a fairly simple weapon, it doesn't have a lot to it. The only point that I will make is that your shots apply the weaken status effect, which increases your damage by 50%. So if you were to fire both of your weapons at the exact same time, the first shot, both of them would deal 100% damage and apply the weaken status effect. And since Ember Gun is like a double tap weapon, then your second shot immediately after that, they will both deal 150%. You can optimize this a little bit more by slightly staggering one weapon behind the other. So you have one that applies the weaken effect, you have the next one that hits that then gets the boost, and then the successive two still get the boost. So instead of 2 that deal 100%, 2 that deal 150, you now have 3 that deal 150 and only 1 that deals the base damage. Not a crazy amount, it's not always gonna matter. The weaken effect stays on them for like 5 seconds, and all successive hits are just gonna be constantly reapplying it. So every single successive hit's gonna be doing 150%. That entire point is only about optimizing like the very first hit that you deal. Arc Torrent. This one deals kind of slower damage, so it's not going to be as much like burst damage as most of these other ones are. And it also does not deal maximum damage outside of 30 meters, even if you use a range implant. Like its max range is 30 base. If you use a range implant, for most weapons, using a range implant to increase the range also increases your optimal range, but for Arc Torrent, it doesn't. It's the only exception to that. And so even if you were using a range implant, you're losing damage if you're hitting anyone outside of 30 meters. Even still, you don't want to be too close because compared to most other decent brawler weapons, Arc Torrent's going to lag behind in terms of DPS. So I would try to keep it in a very tight, like 30 to 40 meters range to maximize the amount of range that you have while also minimizing the amount of damage loss that you get from like the damage fall off. Repeater is very good at close range. In fact, you should try to get as close as possible, essentially up until I think around 10 meters is where you're likely to hit for max damage no matter what. You fire a lot of times all at once, and then once your magazine runs out, you're stuck firing only like once or twice, and then waiting, and then once or twice. You have a lot of burst damage right at the start, and then you lose all of your DPS after that. So you should really try not to engage with enemies that you know are tanky enough to be able to withstand a full magazine and still have a decent amount of HP left, because you just won't have any type of available damage output. Unless you are able to get in there, completely mag dump on them, and then get out quickly, then I would not engage with tanky enemies. And you can either, wait for their shield abilities to go away, just back off, reposition, go after someone else, and wait for some of your teammates to deal some amount of damage to that enemy, and then you can go in and finish them off very quickly. But yeah, otherwise, you're going to take a lot of damage trying to finish them off with Repeater if your initial magazine is not able to kill them. Revoker does not have that problem because it has infinite ammo, right? It can deal as much damage as you want, really, but you want to get as close as possible. As opposed to Repeater, where it's like, it's a matter of damage fall off, right? Where you hit an enemy at 10 meters, it'll deal 100% damage. You hit an enemy at 20 meters, it'll deal maybe 80% damage. It's just a linear fall off from a set specific point. It's just in the game code, right? Revoker, the amount of damage is entirely based on range. range, so even being 4 meters away is better than being 5 meters away. And this is because your DPS is based on how quickly you're firing, and how quickly you're firing is based on your distance to the enemy. Once you fire, it then hits them, it then pulls back. And so what you're really working with is that projectile travel time that's between you and the opponent. And the lower that is, the faster you're going to fire, the more damage you can deal in a shorter amount of time. It's also worth mentioning that because Revoker hits from both directions with one projectile, hitting someone from the back really doesn't benefit you at all. It's just a back hit plus a front hit. It's the same damage, but it's just in the opposite order. The only difference is when someone is using a blockade, mod shield, or maybe like a Sentinel or Ares ability. In this case, you want to position yourself to the side of them so that both hits hit from the side. It's the same total damage, but you're completely ignoring the mod shield. And so repositioning isn't always something that's practical to do. It's not something that you will always do, but that is one thing to really keep in mind, especially against blockade mods, because those can be super tanky. You can increase your damage quite a bit by simply going to the side of them. And the last for the close quarters category is Howler. Howler has the highest range out of all of the close quarters weapons, and since it doesn't exactly have the highest DPS, it is generally advisable to keep yourself at basically as much range as you can. It's also worth noting that because the projectiles of Howler can pass through enemies when there's no shields involved, then you can deal damage to multiple enemies at the same time, so long as it's going straight enough. If someone's really close to you, if someone's like right up here, in order for your weapons to target them, they need to angle inward. That means that their projectiles fire like this and they go across and they don't hit anything that's behind. So keeping distance while also just being generally a good idea, because Howler isn't the highest DPS weapon out there really, is also better for that angle. It allows you to hit multiple enemies at the same time with those projectiles, if it's possible, though usually you won't do that, so it's not like a big deal, but it is something to keep in mind, and it's just another point as to why you should try to keep yourself a little bit further removed and not go for point-blank kills. Moving on to the missile category. Missile rack specifically, this is where we're going to get into a lot of radius conversation. Also applies to storm rack. I think that what a lot of people don't really understand about radius weapons is that it's better to not target the enemy directly. Like, let's say you are here and you're targeting an enemy that is here. If you fire a rocket straight at them and they just happen to move out of the way, your rocket just keeps going off into the distance, it hits nothing. So what you want to do is you want to aim down at their feet. If you aim down at their feet, then even if they move slightly to the left, it's going to hit down at their feet with an explosion radius, and that radius will deal damage to them even if they moved out of the way. Now, you can further exploit this radius by aiming not just at their feet, but slightly behind their feet. This means that the radius will hit from behind, dealing 2 times damage. It deals the back damage multiplier, and that's really what makes a lot of missile weapons extremely good, is because while their damage is whatever number that it says it is, a skilled player is almost always dealing at least 50% more damage than what it actually shows. And this is also what makes missile weapons very bad when the enemy has a height advantage. If they're jumping, then you just miss no matter what, and you can't use the radius. And if they're not jumping, then they're standing on top of something. And whatever it is that they're standing on top of, you will hit the side of that before you hit, the back behind their feet. So it's very important for you as the missile user to be the one with the height advantage. So try to keep as much height advantage as possible at all times. Try never to give yourself explicitly a height disadvantage. That's a very bad thing for you. And of course, while getting closer makes it easier to target specific areas behind someone's feet. For example, if you're not able to kill them in a single magazine, then you are stuck being really close and reloading for a long time, presumably, and they're probably going to kill you. So you want to keep as much range as you can while also trying to make sure that you're close enough to where you can actually hit people reliably. Stormrack just has less missile accuracy, so it's harder to hit people at really high ranges because the missiles like kind of swerve around while they're flying. But the trade-off for Stormrack is that the missiles also get more radius, so it's just easier to use the radius on those weapons. Voltaic RPG. This one also has a pretty decent radius, the same radius as Stormrack, 7.5 meters. But the damage on them is fairly low, so you definitely don't want to get close under almost any circumstance. You're stuck firing one projectile at a time. Your RPM is not very high, like 1 shot per second, and the damage on them is generally not the best. So you want to keep as much range as you possibly can. If you're using Voltaic RPG for whatever reason, you should try to be as removed as possible. Use the radius, of course. It applies the shock effect, which makes it slightly harder for enemies to target you. So just being at a distance and being annoying like that, you can make the best use out of that weapon. Disruptor is another one that only fires 1 projectile at a time. I mean, it only fires 1 projectile, period. But it fires 1 large projectile that has a radius around it while it's flying. So it has what's called a path radius. This path radius will deal damage to enemies while it's passing by. So this one, it is a pretty good idea to fire not directly at them, but to the side of them. If an enemy gets inside the radius, then it will deal a tick of damage every 0.3 seconds, which is equal to the projectile damage. So you can shoot an enemy and hit them directly with the thing, and you'll like maybe 1 tick of damage and then hit them with the projectile. You can fire past the enemy, like shoot to the side of them, and then as it's passing by, it deals like 2 to 3 ticks to them. Or you could also fire similar to Missile Rack and Storm Rack, you could fire at their feet behind them. It will deal a couple ticks and then it will hit the ground, and there's a secondary impact explosion radius that will also hit them yet again. So that's going to be the best way to maximize your damage, which is pretty important considering you only get 1 shot every like 5 seconds. But that's just for maximizing damage. When it comes to using it just in general, it's mostly about positioning. You want to really take the hallways. Where is it that enemies are coming from? If there's an area at any point that they need to step through, that's where you want to basically just keep a constant barrage of projectiles flying. And this will really prevent them from trying to push, which gives your teammates a lot of advantage in terms of capturing beacons while they're being held up, but you also just deal a lot of general damage to them from a pretty decent distance. So it's important to hold those angles and hold those corners. You really shouldn't be trying to hit people who are out in the open. It's much easier to just hold a specific angle and then fire when you think someone's about to pass through, rather than trying to lead a target specifically in one direction when maybe they change direction and your projectiles are so slow that by the time they get there, it might not even hit anymore. And so certainly some maps are going to be better for Disruptor than others, but generally speaking, imagine the entire projectile path as a beam of damage. Where could you place the beam on the map to where it would hit the most enemies at the same time? That's how you want to think about Disruptor. And then you want to take that angle and you want to fire your Disruptors at that angle almost exclusively. Blast RPG. This one is a little tricky because the homing aspect of the rockets, when they get close to an enemy, they will automatically try to home in for those enemies. This makes it easy to hit enemies like a Lacewing or Lancer while they're jumping up in the air. It's very convenient for something like that or something that's just moving really fast. But as you might imagine, that actually actively works against everything that we were talking about in terms of using the radius to deal maximum damage. So your Blast RPG homing in most cases is actively working against you. And so you have to angle your weapons away, you have to angle your target away so that it detects an enemy within whatever range. It tries to correct for that and it turns into them, but it doesn't have enough turn angle to hit them directly, so it hits slightly behind them. This is possible to do, but there's very, very specific angles that you have to fire in order to achieve that, and it's difficult. It's difficult. Hornet is another homing missile weapon, but this one, you want to use the homing as much as you can. Like, the homing is the main reason that you're there. And the reason that the radius doesn't matter on Hornet is because most of your damage comes from the Venom status effect. When you hit someone 2 times with a full burst of Hornet, it will apply a Venom status effect, which deals a significant amount of DOT damage over 2 seconds. Now, obviously, you can just hold the trigger down and you can keep firing, and through your 5 bursts, you'll apply Venom like maybe 2 times. But since the Venom is the bulk of your damage, what you want to do to maximize your damage output is to fire once, you wait for that Venom to go away, and then you fire it again. So like every 2 seconds, you want to fire just 1 volley. You want to fire 1 volley every 2 seconds. That will maximize your damage output. In terms of playstyle, you're going to use these very similar to how you'd use Pod Gun, right? You keep as much distance as possible because you don't have like crazy burst DPS. You have good damage and you have homing, so it's easy damage as well. But what you don't have is a lot of quick damage, and you don't have like crazy amounts of sustained damage either. So you will lose to most like what you call brawler weapons, you know, weapons whose one and only purpose is to be high damage weapons. Hornet will lose to most of those weapons if it's just a head-to-head battle. So you want to stay as far away as you can, you want to use the homing as much as you can. And then the one other point with Hornet is that if you're using two different energy capacity Hornets, whichever one is stronger, whichever one deals more damage, is the one that you should fire last. We'll take the 8 and the 12 for example, because you can buy both of those for credits. The damage from the Venom effect is entirely dependent on which one applies the status effect. If you fire the 8 first and then you fire the 12, that means that the 8 charges up half of the Venom effect, and then the 12 is the one that finishes it off. That's the one that actually applies it, and so you get the 12's version of Venom damage, even though you're not using two 12s, you're just using an 8 and a 12. So in that regard, an 8 and a 12 is stronger than double 10s would be. And that's really important because it also goes the opposite way. If you were to fire the 8 last, then you only deal the 8's worth of Venom damage. And once again, since the Venom damage is kind of the bulk of your total DPS, you're really putting a hit on your damage output if you don't fire that one first. And that brings us to the last of the missile weapons, the most recent one, being Charge Rocket. This one's very interesting because instead of pressing the button to fire a volley, you have to hold the trigger to charge up the volley, and then releasing the trigger is what actually fires it. You can charge up to 6 shots, and if you do charge up all 6 shots, then firing the weapon will give you a 70% speed buff for a few seconds as well. You can keep a constant speed buff. It doesn't matter what energy Charge Rocket it is. They all give the exact same speed buff. So you can keep a constant speed buff by charging one, firing it, and then right as soon as you fire the first one, you start to charge the next one, and then you just stagger, alternate those. You get a constant 70% speed buff. It makes you a lot faster. That's pretty useful. So even if you're not using them to deal damage, you can use them just to get around faster, and that's very nice. But it is not always necessary to charge it up all of the way. Sometimes it's just better to charge up 1 or 2, fire those 1 or 2 to quickly finish off the enemy, and then go back to doing whatever, you know, speed boost optimization that you want to do after that. Moving on to the beam category. Stasis Beam. I mean, we'll cover this because why not? The damage output of Stasis Beam is insanely low. It's insanely low, but it does have the highest range of any beam weapon as well. So the best way to use it, if you are using it for whatever reason, then you just apply stasis to as many enemies as you can see. Just keep them slow, right? It just makes it easier for your allies to take care of them. You could focus down one if they're low HP, but your damage output's kind of impossibly terrible, so you're probably not going to get the kill on that. You do have a nearly infinite mag size, so you can fire basically for forever. It's not quite infinite, but it's almost infinite from 150 meters, and just keeps applying stasis to a bunch of people. Graviton Beam. Now this one is a very good high damage beam weapon, but it also relies on the status effect. The implosion effect that it builds up is the primary source of its damage. Similar to Hornet, the actual physical beam damage is not that high. Your main damage comes from the status effect. So if you're not building that status effect up, you really should be. You're losing a lot of damage on that. The downside of Graviton Beam, obviously, is that you have to chew through all of the mod shields and the galvanic hull and whatever else that they might have going on there. But once you get past all of those extra little things that absorb the implosion effect, then you'll start to deal some serious damage. There's no damage fall off, so you can keep yourself at as much range as you want. Just keep in mind that the only graviton beams that exist are the 10, 12, and the 16, so you will not start off with 2 of them under any circumstance. It's not possible. In order to get 2, you need to get it to rank 6, and this will cut in half the amount of time that it takes to build up that implosion time, and that's really important. Like I mentioned, the implosion is the main part of your damage output, so having 2 is way better than just having 1. Not just because it doubles your damage. I mean, obviously 2 doubles your damage from just 1, but also in terms of practicality. Holding a beam on an enemy for 3 seconds before a status effect goes off can be pretty difficult. It's only really going to happen on enemies who are way out in the open and they're not anywhere near cover. If an enemy is even a little bit near cover, it's very easy for them to cut off your beam before that 3-second time period is able to really build up the implosion. So having to cut that down from 3 seconds to 1.5 seconds is going to make it much easier to actually apply it, even if they're trying to get away from you. Particle Beam is the only one that is really just built on raw damage. It has no special status or any type of effect that it really relies on. It has an infinite magazine beam, but if you hold it on an enemy for a short amount of time, it will build up an even more powerful blast physical hit, which essentially acts as a sniper. That blast mode has 200 meters range, whereas your beam itself only has 100 meters, so it essentially is a sniper, right? But once you fire that blast mode, you will have to wait like 2 seconds for the reload before you then get the beam back, and then you build up the charge all over again. So you don't necessarily want to fire the blast mode whenever you can, especially in cases where you're dealing with multi-layered mod shields. You want to generally use the beam to just work down all of those layers, because it'll work them down pretty quickly. The blast, again, it's just one physical hit, so it'll only take down one layer regardless. So you're really slowing down your damage if you use the blast against a multi-layered mod shield. So you work down those shields, then you can hit them with the heavy projectile. There are obviously little ways of optimizing this as well, because since there is this short reload time after the burst, you then have to wait and then build up the beam all over again. So in a case where an enemy's HP is essentially split into segments of some amount of beam damage followed by the blast damage, if you were to do it with the beam first, then you could immediately follow it up with the blast and you kill them very, very quickly. If you were to hit them with the blast first, then you have to wait for a 2-second reload before you can then finish them off with the beam. So there's a crazy amount of like optimization that you can do with particle beam, really, from a technical standpoint, in terms of optimizing for when you use the blast mode to make sure that it's just barely enough to kill them, so that you use the least amount of beam possible, immediately follow it up with the blast, and that just minimizes your kill time. In most cases, I would say that that specifically is not very practical, so I would opt to kind of purposely overshoot the amount of beam damage that's necessary before hitting them with the blast, just to ensure that you don't have to wait for any stupid reload time first. It's just the safer way of doing it that I think. Burrow Beam is a fairly complex weapon mechanically, but honestly, there's not a lot to know about it in terms of like how to use it. It's very straightforward. Once you press the trigger one time, there is a 1-second charge delay, and then you fire all of your magazine. It's not like any of these other beams where, you know, you have to hold the trigger in order to fire it. The weapon itself has a 30% shield piercing, which is the highest shield piercing out of any weapon. So it's generally fine to hit enemies that have a lot of shields on them, though you may not want to get super close to the enemies unless you know that your magazine is able to kill them in one go. Because again, as soon as you press the trigger, it's a full charge, and then it fires the full magazine, and then you have to wait like 4 seconds before you can do it again. So including another full second of charge time, it's like 5 seconds of wait time where the enemy could be dealing a lot of damage to you. So generally you don't want to be like point blank. Somewhere between like 40 to 80 meters is where I would say. Compound Beam is one that is pretty good to use at basically point blank, and it operates very similar to Particle Beam in the sense that it has an infinite beam mode that charges up a stronger blast mode. Now, Compound Beam's blast is not a sniper shot. Its blast actually has less range, but it applies EMP. And so in this case, as opposed to Particle Beam, what you really want to do is maximize for EMP, as opposed to maximizing for kill time, because when someone's under EMP, they can't hit you back. Meaning that you essentially just want to stagger both of your compound beams one after another. You charge one, fire it. As soon as the EMP wears off, you fire the next one, and it works the same way as like Charge Rocket. Compound Beam can't actually achieve permanent EMP, but it can achieve near permanent EMP, where enemies only have like a 0.75 second time window between each one. So while you're doing that, you want to just be constantly alternating blast modes on them to apply constant EMP, while also circling behind them so that, you know, during that short time period where they have to actually target you, they're not actually going to be able to see you because, you know, you're constantly circling behind them. So on to sniper weapons. Quantum Gun is one that you really have to use primarily against enemies that are like out in the open. It does have really good range, but it takes a while to unload all of its damage, and the damage that it does have is not super great. It also applies Weaken and Stasis, and those two effects will just help yourself or others to kill that enemy. So you can really punish someone who goes out into the open or extends themselves too far with Quantum Gun, but you're really sacrificing a lot of damage to do that. And so you want to keep as much range as you can, and again, primarily focus on enemies that are far out enough into the open to where you can hit them a couple times to apply those two effects onto them. Railgun does not lack in damage, though. Railgun deals a lot of damage. Unfortunately, it has like 3 shots before you have a really, really long reload time, so you have to use your ammo very, very sparingly. Railgun has a bit less effective range than Quantum Gun. It has 160 meters maximum range, but it starts to lose damage after about 100 meters. And again, since your ammo is so low, you can't really afford to be losing damage like that, so you're going to want to be firing from, at very most, 120 meters, but probably keeping around 100. You should pick your targets carefully and stagger your shots. And again, don't just completely mag dump on random things because your reload time is very, very long. EM rifle is a bit more usable in that respect. It only has 1 shot in the magazine, but it is a fixed reload after that time. So every 1 shot, wait like 5 seconds, and then you can shoot again, and it is very consistent. You can't deal as much burst damage as Railgun, because again, Railgun can do 3 shots all in a row with like a 1 second time period between them. EM rifle has only 1 shot, and then it has to wait 5. But essentially, the amount of projectiles that you can get out per minute is higher with EM rifle, because you don't have to wait that extremely long time between each one. Even still, the fact that it only has 1 shot means that you want to keep as far range as possible. Also, the fact that if you're closer than 75 meters to your enemy, you're going to start losing damage. It actually has damage build up as opposed to fall off. So anything above 75 meters within your maximum range of 150 is what you're going to want to keep. And of course, staggering your shots. An enemy that might take 2 hits to kill, you might need to fire both of your shots at them, or you might just need to shoot 1 time and get lucky with double damage. So you should always fire 1 and then wait and see if you need the other and essentially stagger them in that way. Tetra rifle has no fall off, no build up. It doesn't have to deal with any of that. And it also has 4 shots, but the first 3 do almost nothing. You should treat these first 3 shots purely as just charging shots for the final one, which means if you miss any more than 1 of those charging shots, just reload and start all over again, because the damage from your final shot depends on how many of those first 3 shots you hit. If you hit all 3 of them, then your final shot deals a lot of damage, and then you have a short reload before you can do that all over again. If you're missing shots, then you're wasting time, so it's best to only really work in, at very least, 2 charges out of the 3, but ideally you want all of your shots to hit. Continuum, on the other hand, does not need to be nearly as careful. It has an infinite magazine and pretty high RPM, so 2 shots per second, so you can just hold down the trigger. In any case, it doesn't really matter. You don't necessarily want to be holding it down all the time because it prevents you from sprinting, but you could be holding it down literally all the time and nothing really bad would happen to you. There's no damage fall off, there's no reload time, you just pull the trigger, essentially. Though you do want to stagger your shots very slightly to optimize for destroying multi-layered mod shield, because again, one of your shots might apply the double damage and take down a mod layer on its own, whereas if you hit it with 2 shots at the same time, then, you know, you just basically just wasted a shot. So you want to alternate them slightly, the same way that you would with like Ember Gun, and also try to keep your distance, because even though Continuum has an infinite magazine, it does not have a great DPS, all things considered. A weapon like this might seem super OP, but inside of the context of that most weapons are used in tangent with the ability, like let's say you have a Panther, you deploy the barrier to keep yourself protected while you go out and deal damage. You are reliant on that ability duration to keep you protected. Once that's over, the fact that Continuum has infinite ammo doesn't matter anymore. You don't have infinite protection. So it's still not crazy and should be used at a bit of range. Your DPS is not super high, and you want to keep yourself rather protected while you're essentially spamming them. Quasher is the last of the snipers. You have 8 shots, similar to Tetra Rifle, where essentially their only purpose is to charge up the secondary shots that it deals afterward. However many shots that you hit from the tiny sadness pellets that it fires at first, that is how many big boy, Giga Chad rockets you're going to fire in the enhanced mode. Those rockets work a lot like Gemini, where they deal a lot of damage, and getting more of them is very, very important because that is where your main damage comes from. So you want to charge up as many of those as possible so that you can then swap from playing extremely passive to playing not necessarily aggressive, but you're playing a bit more upfront because now you actually have damage output in the form of those homing projectiles. Onto the guided weapons, Helix Rack. First and foremost, I think most people understand how Helix Rack works. It's very high burst damage from overhead, right? Which means that you can, for the most part, bypass a lot of mod shields. You can bypass abilities like Bastion or Citadel and deal quite a lot of damage. As opposed to sideways homing, like what Podgun and Hornet have, these fire upward and will curve down. Now you can force them to fire from the side with the fact that they all fire after a single button press. So as soon as you hit the trigger, all of the rockets will fire. You can curve these rockets around a corner very effectively if you were to look at the enemy, press the button, and then quickly turn your mech to force them to fire in a different trajectory, and you can get some very, very high angle curving shots from that. Disc Launcher is the only guided weapon that does not require a target lock, but you do generally want it because it ensures that you deal the maximum damage. Even though your radius is high, you deal less damage if the enemy is further away from the point of impact. So realistically, you just want to hit them directly. Your DPS is not high by any means or stretch, so you want to keep distance as much as possible while also ensuring that you get the homing, and anything outside of 60 meters is you're going to lose damage from that, and you're going to lose the homing capability. So you want to stick yourself right around the 60 meter mark. This will ensure that you get homing when you want it, and then if someone's behind cover or something and you don't want the homing anymore, you can step just outside of that 60 meter range and use the high radius with reduced damage, but high radius nonetheless, to deal damage to that enemy even as they are in cover. Savant is a weapon that I think a lot of people don't fully understand either. If you've used it before, you probably know that it has two main ways of firing. Sometimes it fires perfectly straight, like a missile weapon. Other times it fires sort of upward. Not quite like a helix rack, but a little bit, like it kind of spreads upward. And the weapon is the thing that determines whether or not this happens. The way that it determines this is simply whether or not there is a visible line between you and the enemy that you're firing at. If there is an obstacle in the way, then it will fire the rocket slightly upward. If you have a straight line shot at the enemy directly at the very center of their mech, then it will simply fire straight. And that is the only thing that it looks for. And once you realize that, it's actually insanely simple. But that's one thing that I think a lot of people don't really know about it. So you can use this to sort of optimize whether or not you want them to go up. Sometimes you want them to go up, sometimes you want them to go straight, and you can use that fact to make it easier for you to actually reliably do one or the other. It is also worth mentioning that Savant, while it can target up to 3 enemies at the same time, and targeting multiple enemies will apply a damage multiplier onto each of your projectiles. You will deal more total damage the more enemies that you target, but each enemy takes less damage individually. So if you really just want to focus down one enemy specifically, you should try to focus on them and them only, as opposed to targeting 3 enemies at the same time. That makes sure that you deal the maximum amount of damage to them. Even though your total damage is less, your individual damage is higher. Strike Rocket is a very simple one. It's honestly extremely, extremely simple. There's not a lot to know. You basically just use it as a longer range helix rack. You don't really have to like flick the rockets because you just shoot one rocket at a time, and it has a really wide just homing angle just by default. So you really can get a lot of different angles with it, and it is very good for just general suppressive fire. Obviously, since it fires a bit upward, you want to stick yourself behind some kind of short cover so that you can fire at visible enemies without yourself being visible. Once again, most of these weapons, like snipers and guided weapons, they will mostly lose out to any of these like brawler type weapons, like the assault category, the close quarters category, and to a large extent the heavy duty category as well. And so you want to reduce the extent to which you are exposing yourself to enemies, but since you have a guided weapon, you don't have to do that. You could just stick in cover, right? And that's basically all. Gemini is another one of these sideways homing type of weapons. So similar to like Podgun and Hornet, this one does not fire upward. It only fires straight and then it homes in horizontally. Similar to Strike Rocket, it also has a very wide lock angle, so you can stay behind cover and just kind of turn yourself and still be able to target an enemy that you're locked onto. Since each projectile, same as Quantum Gun, applies both stasis and weaken, the first one applying weaken, which increases your total damage, you want to treat it sort of the same that you would with Ember Gun, where you stagger them just slightly to ensure that 3 of your 4 shots get the weaken bonus as opposed to only 2 of them. But Gemini is an extremely forgiving weapon. It has insane base range, but the projectile speed is fairly low. So you can stay at pretty much as far back as you want, but you're only really going to be effective at holding very open areas. Fuse Mortar is the only artillery weapon that we're even going to be talking about. It's the same as Rocket Mortar, though, honestly, in terms of how you use it. Really, there's like the main thing that I would even say about this is one thing that I'm not even going to talk about on any of these other weapons, and it's about when to spawn it. You should not ever spawn a mortar build if you have a beacon disadvantage. If you're playing a beacon mode and you have the disadvantage, let's say the enemy has the center beacon, do not spawn it. Like, do yourself a favor, don't spawn that. What you should do is you should wait until you have the advantage, and then you can spawn it. Now, what this does is it forces enemies to move from places that they don't want to move from. They are going to be in a bit of a struggle to try to take that center beacon as is. You can apply constant pressure onto it to force them off of it if need be, but also you can just force them to move from whatever spawn location they are spawning at, and it really reduces the amount of time that they have to think, time that they have to prep, time that they have to wait for reloads and abilities. They'll be taking overhead damage basically the entire time. So it's a nice way. It's very, very decent weapon if you're using it in the right circumstances, but you should always use it as a way to pressure enemies into making mistakes or keep pressure onto enemies while you are holding the advantage, rather than trying to use it to gain the advantage, because it's just not going to happen. And now on to the last category, the most gamer category, the heavy duty one, starting off with minigun. So minigun it's a fairly simple one. It's very easy to understand how to use it. It's just fairly difficult to actually get into that habit of using it. You have to keep in mind that while you're firing, it reduces your turn speed. You have to keep in mind that even though the weapon has a really, really large spread, its effective range is pretty decent. You have to keep in mind that if you accidentally run out of ammo, or if you just accidentally reload, your reload time is insanely long, so you can't overexpose yourself. So you both have a ton of damage output and no damage output, depending on whether or not you play it properly. But generally, the best advice that I could give you is just to keep your barrels spinning. There's a 1-second delay before you actually start to deal damage, and this 1-second delay can cause you to take unnecessary damage. So what you want to do is you want to spin up your barrels, you want to essentially charge that up first, and you just keep feathering that, right? You keep feathering the trigger to keep your barrels spun so that as soon as you need damage output, you can just hold it down and you'll get almost immediate damage output from that. That's very good. You also don't want to preemptively reload. If you're going to reload, you want to go as far away as you can, in as much safety as you can, and then reload, because the reload is very, very, very long. You don't want to get too close to enemies because, again, it's not as high DPS as something like Revoker. It's going to lose to a Revoker, but you don't want to get too far back either because your spread is fairly high. It is best used, I would say, between 20 and 50 meters-ish, just at base. If you have a maxed spread implant, you could probably get up to about 100 meters without losing too much damage. You'll deal full damage at 60 meters, but you could probably get to about 100 and still be fine. Chain gun is similar-ish in the sense that it also has a bit of spin up, but the spin up forces you to spend projectiles. So it's not quite a delay, it is more of a build up. It takes 2 seconds for it to build up to its max RPM, but all the while you are wasting bullets. And chain gun has only half the magazine that minigun does, and it has less damage per bullet as well. So your DPS is fairly low. You need as much magazine as you can. You are almost certainly going to have to reload after every kill, because almost every kill is going to take most of a full magazine. Since your damage is fairly low, and since you will be constantly reloading all the time, and since you will be spending some bullets on the spin up every single time, you are going to want to keep as much distance as you can. Thankfully, chain gun doesn't have a crazy amount of spread, and the max range is okay, but it does kind of lose damage after range, and it does have some spread, so it's best used like 60 to 100 meters-ish, and if possible, never used up close. Dreadshot is another one that's DPS is in comparison fairly low. You're not going to want to use it up close. It is sort of a sniper substitute with a very large mag, but the damage per shot is not as high. So it's a pretty okay ranged weapon. Like 50 to 100 meters is about where I would try to keep that. And, you know, keep in mind the mag size is pretty high, so you don't really have to worry about reloading all the time like you do with chain gun. But you should reload when you can, just because the reload time of it is like not super short either. Hellfire is similar to Dreadshot in the way that the mag size is fairly high and the reload is not that long. You're most likely not going to reload after every kill. You're probably going to try to take 2 or 3 before you reload. In the case of Hellfire, though, it does have the burn status effect. This effect will slowly damage enemies for 10 seconds. So that's a really long time. You deal 10 seconds of constant damage after applying burn to them, which means that if you hit the same enemy with your entire magazine, like it's still only one burn effect, right? So the entire time that you're killing one enemy, you're still only burning them one time. You're still only getting one burn status effect from them. Its range is only 40 meters, but the damage is very high. Even though the damage is very high, it is also sort of slow in the sense that a lot of that is attributed to the burn status effect. The burn status effect applying over 10 seconds, so it's a very long period of time. It's a good amount of damage, but it's over a very long period of time. So if you are using Hellfire on an aggressive mech, as you should be, and you're rushing toward a group of enemies, especially if you're rushing toward multiple enemies, you can maximize your total damage output by first applying the burn effect to everyone in the group and then focusing down one enemy at a time. This means that while you're focusing down one enemy, everyone else is slowly taking burn damage, and even if you end up dying there, instead of just killing the one guy, you kill the one guy and also deal a bunch of damage to all the other guys. So your total damage for that engagement just becomes way higher. Suppressor has very decent burst damage, all things considered, and it applies a status effect that reduces enemy damage. So you can use it as a bit of support, but it also just kind of helps to keep you alive and is a substitute for the sort of lack of damage output that you have. It is by no means a high damage weapon, but it's decent enough. It is worth keeping in mind that the first application of the drain status effect that Suppressor has will reduce enemy damage by 15% versus all of the other successive hits that you do will only stack 5% onto that. So your first hit is 3 times as effective as your second hit, which means if you want to maximize your effectiveness in terms of the status effect, you should shoot every enemy in sight 1 time to get at least 15% less damage on all of them before then focusing down 1. Now that's if you're using it in a more removed and supportive type of manner. If your goal is to kill stuff, then obviously you want to use it more as a missile because it does have a radius and is very accurate as well. So you can hit slightly behind an enemy, use the radius to deal damage, be slowly reducing their damage as well. Just keep in mind that the DPS of Suppressor itself is not crazy high, and so you do not want to get super close to most enemies. You want to keep yourself around 60 meters away at least. Versa has 2 firing modes, same as some of these other ones. You can hold the trigger down to essentially have a minigun, less ammo, but also more accuracy, or you can just tap the fire button and it will have a sniper mode. and that sniper mode will fire 20 of your bullets all at the same time, but with a bit of a negative multiplier onto it. So if you want to maximize your damage per magazine, you should just use the machine gun mode. It deals more damage overall. In most cases, you should just use that mode, and only if there is an enemy that's kind of far away, or if the enemy is pretty low HP, then you can use the sniper mode to finish them off. But again, generally speaking, just spamming the sniper mode 5 times is going to be way, way less effective than a full magazine of the machine gun mode. So for most purposes, you can essentially use this as an alternative to minigun. The maximum range is not that high. It is only 85, but you have pretty good accuracy even at 85 meters, so you don't lose that much damage as opposed to minigun, which definitely does lose a bit of damage at that range. You deal more damage per projectile, at least as of right now, with the modifier that's on Versa during the season, and your reload is also significantly shorter, though it is still fairly long, right? You shouldn't be ultra aggressive with it, because if you have to reload during an engagement, you're kind of screwed. It's like a 10-second reload time. It's completely unacceptable in a brawler situation, but it is more manageable than minigun. And so those are just a few small tips to help you perform slightly better. I hope you found this video helpful. If you did, let me know what other similar types of videos I could do, like mechs, for example. And if you didn't, then I appreciate you watching the entire thing anyway. That will be it for me. I appreciate y'all. Take care.